Let us go more deeply into this reference. I consider my body with its centripetal and centrifugal nerves, with its nerve centers. I know that external objects make in the afferent nerves a disturbance which passes onward to the centers, that the centers are the theater of very varied molecular movements, and that these movements depend on the nature and position of the objects. Change the objects, or modify their relation to my body, and everything is changed in the interior movements of my perceptive centers, but everything is also changed in my perception. My perception is, then, a function of these molecular movements. It depends upon them. But how does it depend upon them? It will perhaps be said that it translates them, and that, in the main, I represent to myself nothing but the molecular movements of cerebral substance. But how should this have any meaning, since the image of the nervous system and of its internal movements is only, by hypothesis, that of a certain material object, whereas I represent to myself the whole material universe? It is true that many philosophers attempt to evade the difficulty. They show us a brain analogous in its essence to the rest of the material universe, an image, consequently, if the universe is an image. Then, since they want the internal movements of this brain to create or determine the representation of the whole material world, an image infinitely greater than that of the cerebral vibrations, they maintain that these molecular movements, and movement in general, are not images like others, but something which is either more or less than an image. In any case, is of another nature than an image, and from which representation will issue as by miracle. Thus matter is made into something radically different from representation, something of which consequently we have no image. Over against it they place a consciousness empty of images, of which we are unable to form any idea. Lastly, to fill consciousness, they invent an incomprehensible action of this formless matter upon this matterless thought. But the truth is that the movements of matter are very clear, regarded as images, and that there is no need to look in movement for anything more than what we see in it. The sole difficulty would consist in bringing forth from these very particular images the infinite variety of representations. But why seek to do so, since we all agree that the cerebral vibrations are contained in the material world, and that these images, consequently, are only a part of the representation? What then are these movements, and what part do these particular images play in the representation of the whole? The answer is obvious. They are, within my body, the movements intended to prepare, while beginning it, the reaction of my body to the action of external objects. Images themselves, they cannot create images, but they indicate at each moment, like a compass that is being moved about, the position of a certain given image, my body, in relation to the surrounding images. In the totality of representation, they are very little, but they are of capital importance for the part of representation which I call my body, since they foreshadow at each successive moment its virtual acts. There is then only a difference of degree. There can be no difference in kind between what is called the perceptive faculty of the brain and the reflex functions of the spinal cord. The cord transforms into movements the stimulation received. The brain prolongs it into reactions which are merely nascent, but in the one as in the other, the function of the nerve substance is to conduct, to coordinate, or to inhibit movements. How then does it come about that my perception of the universe appears to depend upon the internal movements of the cerebral substance, to change when they vary, and to vanish when they cease? The difficulty of this problem is mainly due to the fact that the gray matter and its modifications are regarded as things which are sufficient to themselves, and might be isolated from the rest of the universe. Materialists and dualists are fundamentally agreed on this point. They consider certain molecular movements and the cerebral matter apart. Then some see in our conscious perception a phosphorescence which follows these movements and illuminates their track. For others, our perceptions succeed each other like an unwinding scroll in a consciousness which expresses continuously in its own way the molecular vibrations of the cortical substance. In the one case, as in the other, our perception is supposed to translate or to picture the states of our nervous system. But is it possible to conceive the nervous system as living apart from the organism which nourishes it, from the atmosphere in which the organism breathes, from the earth which that atmosphere envelops, from the sun round which the earth revolves? More generally, does not the fiction of an isolated material object imply a kind of absurdity, since this object borrows its physical properties from the relations which it maintains with all others, and knows each of its determinations, and consequently its very existence, the place which it occupies in the universe as a whole? Let us no longer say that our perceptions depend simply upon the molecular movements of the cerebral mass. We must say rather that they vary with them, but that these movements themselves remain inseparably bound up with the rest of the material world. The question, then, is not only how our perceptions are connected with the modifications of the gray matter. The problem widens and can also be put in much clearer terms. It might be stated as follows: here is a system of images which I term my perception of the universe, and which may be entirely altered by a very slight change in a certain privileged image, my body. This image occupies the center. By it, all the others are conditioned. At each of its movements, everything changes, as though by a turn of a kaleidoscope. Here, on the other hand, are the same images, but referred each one to itself, influencing each other, no doubt, but in such a manner that the effect is always in proportion to the cause. This is what I term the universe. The question is, how can these two systems coexist? and why are the same images relatively invariable in the universe, and infinitely variable in perception? The problem at issue between realism and idealism, perhaps even between materialism and spiritualism, should be stated then, it seems to us, in the following terms. How is it that the same images can belong at the same time to two different systems, the one in which each image varies for itself and in the well-defined measure that is patient of the real action of surrounding images, the other in which all change for a single image, and in the varying measure that they reflect the eventual action of this privileged image?